Over the past 2 years, I've worked my way up from running my first 50k ultramarathon to running my first 100-mile ultramarathon. I've had some really tough times, and I've made some massive mistakes along the way. I've also made some life-defining memories and achieved goals I never thought would be possible. I've gone from a nervous beginner to a runner that can turn up to ultramarathons with a fairly high confidence that I will get to the finish line. And along the way, I've learned a lot about myself. My perception of running has totally changed. I've made some pretty significant changes in my life because of this journey. So I want to look back over those ultramarathons that got me to my first 100-miler and talk about the lessons that I learned along the way. Just before running my first 50k ultramarathon, one of my really close friends went out and ran a 50-mile ultramarathon. He'd never run a marathon before, so this was by far his longest run ever. And he didn't really train properly for it. And as a result, he got such a bad knee injury during the event that he couldn't run for like 2 more years, like complete nightmare scenario. And so knowing this, I was obviously quite nervous about doing my first ultramarathon. My training really focused on making sure that I conditioned my body for the event to make sure there was as little chance as possible that I would get an injury that would take me out. The 50k that I chose to do was the Hurtwood 50k, a pretty hilly woodland ultramarathon along the Green Sand Way. And despite only being about 8k more than a marathon, the race had 1,200 meters of elevation gain. At this point, I'd had no experience running a race with this kind of elevation. And so in preparation for the event, I decided I really need to condition my body for running hills. And so I decided I was going to try and match my training elevation to the race elevation. If I was running 50k in a week, I'd run 1,200 meters of elevation. If I was running 100k in a week, I'd run 2,400 meters elevation. And I'd never really done this much hill training before. Most of my training in the past had been on the flat. And I think it's fair to say that I pushed my body too far. I went straight in with the elevation without easing into it. And my body definitely wasn't ready for this kind of training. And as a result, I pushed my body too far and I picked up a foot injury. I couldn't run at all for 4 weeks. And in the last 7 years, this is the worst running injury I've got. And the longest break I've had to take from running in the last 7 years. I was actually super lucky though, because due to the pandemic, the race got delayed by about 4 months. So that 4 weeks I had off from training wasn't too bad. I managed to rebuild my fitness back up and get to the event injury-free. And like with many of these big races, the first half felt super comfortable, very similar to like a marathon. The first half of it felt ridiculously easy. And so I was pushing the pace a bit. And a fairly big mistake I made was thinking that I should run up the hills. So it didn't matter if it was flat, downhill, uphill, I was running and I was just trying to keep moving, and I did very, very little walking in this race. But because of that, when I got to about halfway, I really started to feel fatigue in my legs. And that was when the cramping started at about 30k into the race. And that was the main issue I had for the back half of the race, just my fatigue in my legs and muscles just started to build and build and build. And I think if I'd have paced it better to start, if I'd run that first 30k more conservatively and walked the uphills, I wouldn't have had the same kind of issues. But towards the end, that cramping and fatigue in my muscles was by far my biggest concern. And that cramp got so bad that in the last 5k, I actually had to stop and stretch out. And it's the only time in any ultramarathon that I've run that cramp has got so bad that I had to stop. And you could physically see the cramp in my muscles. And I had to fully stop, sit down, stretch out the muscle until it went away and I was able to get moving again. But despite that, I finished my first ultramarathon, my first 50k, in 5 hours and 12 minutes. So I was super happy just to get to the finish line. And so my biggest takeaway from my first ultramarathon was to train sufficiently, but to train smart. So build conditioning in your body so that you can handle the distance, so you're not gonna get injuries, but also don't push your body beyond what it's ready to cope. Build up to it. Don't go and run an ultramarathon without training, but also don't try and follow the training of an elite runner because you think, oh, if they're doing it for an event, that's what I should be doing. Training for an ultramarathon, especially a 50k, doesn't need to be dramatically different to a marathon. If you did a marathon training block for a 50k or even a 50-miler, it's gonna be perfectly sufficient to get you to the finish line. And then a year later, I decided to finally take on my first 50-mile ultramarathon, the South Downs Way 50. And personally, that jump from 50k to 80k was massive for me mentally. Going from running 5 hours to 9 or 10 hours is a totally different proposition. And so naturally I was far more nervous for this event than I had been for my first 50k. And so my pacing plan for this event was to use my heart rate to pace the race. I was going to try and keep my heart rate below 150, 155 for the entire event. But as soon as I got to the start line, I realized that because of the adrenaline, the nerves, my heart rate, even before I started running, was way higher than it normally is. And so as soon as I started running, my heart rate went straight up into like tempo or a hard effort type heart rate. And because of that extreme reading on my heart rate, I decided, actually, I'm going to ignore my heart rate because it doesn't feel right based on the effort that I'm putting in. And as a result, the main thing that I was going to use to keep my pace within check had gone out the window, and I didn't have a backup. And so for that first part of the race, I really went out much harder than I should have. And as a result of that, by halfway, I was starting to feel fatigue and cramping. I think the first bit of cramp I had was 40k in, so only at the halfway mark did I start to feel cramp in my legs. And I think it's just my body wasn't ready for the pace that I set in that first half. And I really should have gone out a bit more conservatively, and therefore I would have finished stronger. And that fatigue and cramping built to a point that in the final third of the race, I was enjoying the hills more than I was enjoying the flats and downhills, because it was giving me the opportunity to recover and rest my legs. But it was as soon as I started moving at any pace, that's when the cramping started to come back. And I've never had that in a race where I enjoyed the uphills more than the downs. And this is something you often hear people talk about in like mountain ultramarathons, where they're doing crazy elevation and the downhills absolutely destroy their quads. And I experienced that on the South Downs Way 50 just because of the pacing that I went out in the first half. And so despite my pace slowly fading as the cramping got worse and worse, I managed to finish my first 50-mile ultramarathon, the South Downs Way 50, in 8 hours and 45 minutes. And I really underestimated the importance of pacing in that first 50-miler. It doesn't matter if you're racing a mile or 100 miles, having a really, really solid pacing strategy is the biggest difference in terms of whether you're going to succeed or fail. And pacing an ultramarathon to finish strong makes it so much more enjoyable. But this was my first experience of running an ultramarathon where you feel like you're running for pretty much the whole day, from sunrise to sunset. And I absolutely loved it. Throughout the whole day, just covering lots of ground. Yeah, it was a special experience. But I know I needed to approach my first 100k totally differently. So only 3 months later, I turned up to the Serpent Trail 100k to run my next ultramarathon. But going into this race, I was a lot less nervous because it was only just an extra 20k on top of the South Downs Way 50, so not dramatically further. But my approach was totally different. So I decided to pace this race by 10k sections. And right from the start, I made sure I kept my pace conservative. And that was really difficult because the whole field set off at quite a fast pace. And I found myself in the back end of the field. And having people overtake you that you think you should be running faster than really gives the ego a bit of a hit. And by that first checkpoint, I was something like 20 or 30th from the back of the field. And so in this race, I had a really conservative pacing plan. I had a heart rate goal that I wanted to try and keep my heart rate below. And also I had this plan to start slow and work my way through the field from start to finish. I get the impression that people approach ultramarathons very differently. Like, some go out hard and really embrace the pain, the suffering. That's why they turn up to do these events, to really see how much pain that they can endure. But then every ultra, you see a large group of people who are out there just enjoying the event. They take it easy, they run within themselves. Even when they get to the finish, they don't look wrecked. They look like they've gone out and just enjoyed the event. And yes, they go out and they suffer, and sometimes it's hard, but that suffering isn't necessarily the goal of the event. And as the event progressed, I got stronger and stronger. And from pretty much that first aid station, I started picking off other runners and working my way through the field. And I managed to keep that up for pretty much the entire race, up to the finish. Most importantly, I had an incredible time. just slowly increasing my pace as the race went on. And I finished my first 100k in 12 hours and 11 minutes. And at that finish line, I was tired, but I wasn't wrecked. Like, I didn't really scrape the bottom of the barrel in terms of effort. So I got to the finish line tired, but felt like I could run further. I felt like I had made the most of the experience. And my fastest 10k section of the entire race happened to be that final 10k, which was just a great feeling from running my longest event ever, but finishing so strong. And I realized that my motivation for running these ultramarathons isn't to suffer. Like, I'm not there to see how much pain I can endure. I really want to do these events because I enjoy them. And I always find people, when I talk to them at work or friends and family about these events, they just don't understand why. But I do genuinely love doing these longer distance races. And yes, I want to run a fast time, I want to do well, but that's completely secondary to actually enjoying the event. I think it's really important to figure out what your motivation is for doing ultramarathons. If you're going out there to see how much pain you can endure, yeah, go out hard, push yourself to the limit. But if you're there to enjoy it, start slow, and then only if you feel good at the end do you start to pick up the pace. Have a really solid pacing strategy that means you can go out there and enjoy it and get to the finish line feeling like the experience wasn't just terrible. And so, having finally run 50k, 50 miles, and then 100k, it was time to do the big one, the 100-miler. And this is something that I've wanted to do for years. Ever since I started running, I thought it was crazy that people did these at big events. So massively a bucket list race for me. And I fully expected this race to be different to other ultras. I've watched enough race films, I've read articles about 100-milers, and every time people do these events, it seems to be different. And the difference between running 100k in 12 hours and running for 24 hours through the night, there's just so much more to it. But going into this race, I felt prepared, like I'd trained really well. I didn't overstrain my body. I had a really solid plan for what I was going to do during the event. I had a really conservative pacing strategy that I knew I was going to stick to for the first half of the race, whatever happened. And I knew my first goal was to finish the race, but I also wanted to enjoy it. So I wasn't going to do anything that put that at risk. But there's definitely no guarantee you'll enjoy running 100 miles. Like, it's bloody hard. That was always an unknown. And so the race I chose was the South Downs Way 100, starting in Winchester where I live, finishing in Eastbourne, going the full length of the South Downs Way. And so I set out conservatively. I ran the first few hours on my goal pace and pretty much stuck to my pacing strategy. And I was just happily plodding along at the back of the field for the first few hours. And then the heat came. Started at about 25 degrees, built up to about 33 degrees. Essentially, we spent 7 hours in direct sunlight without any shade. And here in the UK, we'd had no weather that came anywhere near to that kind of temperature in the build up to the race. So I had zero acclimation to warm, hot weather training. And that heat built to a point where I really started to struggle, and I definitely wasn't the only one. I saw people throwing up, other people just were lying down in the shades to recover. I saw people walking along like zombies, like barely standing on their feet. And I definitely walked the line of heat stroke, like 50-50, I wasn't sure which way it was going to land. And 43% of the runners from this race dropped out, so I wasn't the only one suffering out there. And because of the heat, I hit a low point that I've never experienced before in a race, where emotionally I was so drained by the difficulty of the heat. My energy levels and my emotions just dropped to a new low. And I was really questioning why I was doing the event, whether I should drop out. And it just stopped being fun because it got so hard. And then late afternoon, the sun finally dropped and it started to cool down. But as soon as that happened, of course, my stomach turned and I couldn't put any food or drink into my stomach for about a 2-hour period. So to go through that low, and then just as I think things are starting to turn around, I have the issue with my stomach. Yeah, it was really difficult. And at that point, the outlook for this race looked pretty bleak. But as night came, my stomach turned and I had a second wind and I started to feel great. And I spent the night running really hard, pushing the pace as hard as I could, overtaking runners, and I was absolutely loving it. And like running through fields at night with this tiny circle of light in front of me, I could see a line of head torches off into the distance and a line behind me. And like going into this race, the thought of running at night on my own in fields full of like livestock, it was terrifying, right? I thought it would be really scary, but actually I really enjoyed the experience. Like, you know, when you go out running in a storm in the middle of summer and it's warm but it's just torrential rain and you're splashing through puddles and you get that childish grin on your face, that's what it felt like. Like I was just running through, having so much fun. And in that nighttime I got into this like racing mindset where I was constantly trying to pick off the next runner, and I was looking back to check that no other runners were catching me up. And as the sun started to rise over the track, I came in to finish my first 100 miler in 22 hours and 2 minutes. And despite the lows and the challenges, I absolutely loved my first 100 miler. Like, yes, there were brutal moments, but it was an amazing experience. 100 miles is a bloody long way, and there is so much time for something to go wrong. You need to really respect the distance. In 100 miles, you can't expect everything to go right. Things will go wrong. It could be the weather, it could be your stomach, it could be your body, it could be your mind. You need to prepare for it, and if you have a plan to overcome anything that comes your way, then there's no reason why you can't get to that finish line. For me, I just had this mantra of keeping moving. I knew that if I stopped to try and let my stomach settle down, I might not have been able to keep moving. I spent maybe less than 20 minutes throughout the whole of the 22-hour period stationary at aid stations. I just kept grabbing what I needed and moving on. And that, I think, really helped me get to the finish line. Running these ultramarathons over the last 2 years has been an incredible experience. It's very likely changed the direction of my life, and it's definitely changed the way I perceive running as a sport, but also as part of my life. And if you're thinking about entering the world of ultramarathons, do it. Don't hesitate. It might not be easy, but it's a special kind of fun. Here we go. Ooh, downhill now. This weather could not be more perfect. Right, that's 50k in 5 hours 22. Oh, we're here on the track. This is amazing. What a beautiful trail. Oh, I can see the finish line of my first 100k. Oh. Here we go. This is stunning. Oh wow. Oh, I'm really struggling here. I'm really struggling with this hill. I was quite worried about this running at night, but it's actually lovely. Oh, 400 meters. Oh, let's get this done. Oh, here we go. My first 100 miler. Oh, done.